We're going to bring to the microphone Mr. Christopher Ferrara, who's an attorney. He's founder and president of American Catholic Lawyers Association. And he is also author of numerous articles. You met him yesterday. He's also co-authored the third edition of Fatima Priest. And this afternoon, Chris is going to be talking to us on the subject of why more priests do not promote the full Fatima message. Chris Ferrara.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. My friend John gave a talk on Teilhard de Chardin. I know he's very upset about Teilhard's teaching, but it occurred to me that it's a simple matter of proving or disproving what Teilhard taught. I propose an empirical confirmation of his teaching. I'm a little tired tonight, so let's see if this rock can deliver my speech. I think under the law of complexification, it should be just a matter of time before the rock achieves consciousness and delivers my speech for me. So, if you don't mind. I guess John's assessment of Teilhard was correct after all. Yeah. Well, then the Fatima conference in the year 5010 will bring the rock back, and we'll see what happens. I'm told my talk is on why more priests do not preach the full Fatima message. Unfortunately, I prepared a talk on the 50 top home improvement tips. But I will do my best with the topic. When I was a kid, I'm sure many of you remember this too, I used to watch the Abbott and Costello show. And there was a very hilarious skit on Abbott and Costello where Abbott and Costello go into a local diner. And Abbott says to Costello before they go in, "We don't have enough money for two of us to eat, so I'll order something and we'll share it. And if the waitress comes to you and asks you for an order, just tell her you're not interested, you're not hungry, you don't want anything." Then they go into the diner and they sit down, and Abbott orders a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and the waitress comes over to Costello and says, "So, sweetie, what would you like?" And Costello says, nothing at all. And then Abbott says, "Go on, order something. Go ahead." So Costello says, "Okay, I'll have a sandwich." And then Abbott smacks him in the head. And he says, "What'd you smack me for? You told me to order something." And he says, "I told you not to order anything." And the waitress comes up to him again and says, "Well, what would you like, sweetie?" And he starts to get fidgety because he's looking over at Abbott, and Abbott says, "Go ahead, order something." And he orders something again, and Abbott smacks him in the head again. Now, we laugh at that because it's absurd, and that makes it hilarious. But it wouldn't be very absurd if something like that happened to us in real life, would it? If we were out with our friends somewhere who told us to do something, and then having done what he told us to do, he smacked us in the head. It wouldn't be funny at all. It would be outrageous. It would be unjust. It would be unfair. But that is precisely the situation in which Father Nicholas Gruner has found himself, and I think his case is an illustration of why it is that more priests don't preach the full Fatima message, because the preaching of that message can be a very risky undertaking. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Father Gruner's case. I'm sure you all want to know where he stands today, canonically speaking. I'll give you a brief history and tell you where he is today, and draw some comparisons between the treatment of Father Gruner and priests like him and the treatment of priests and nuns who basically attack the teachings of the Church with impunity for years and even decades, while nothing is done about them. And that illustrates the paradox of the Church in post-conciliar times, that it's very dangerous to preach the full and authentic message of Fatima, or indeed to defend any element of traditional Catholicism too vocally and too successfully. Father Gruner's story began with his ordination in 1977 as a priest in Frigento, Italy. His original plan was to join the Franciscan-speaking English community there, but that community never got off the ground, so he ended up being ordained to the Diocese of Avellino. But in that particular diocese, there was a strange local dialect that he had never mastered, and the Bishop of Avellino made it clear from the start that Father Gruner would never really have a canonical mission in Avellino, that he should investigate some other options. And in fact, because of the language problem, Father Gruner could not hear confessions or even deliver a sermon unless it was completely typed out in advance and approved by the bishop. Well, that was an impossible situation to be in. And the Bishop of Avellino was quite content to have Father Gruner look elsewhere for incarnation, because there really was no future for him in Avellino, and the parties never really intended that there be a future there. When it turned out that he would not be able to join the Franciscan community, he had to go somewhere else where his skills would be needed. So, in 1978, the bishop gave him written permission in the form of a decree which permitted him to reside outside the Diocese of Avellino while he found another bishop or some other mission as a priest in the church. And it turns out that in 1978, at the recommendation of an Eastern Orthodox, I should say an Eastern Rite bishop, he was seated on the board of directors of the apostolate known as the National Committee for the National Pilgrim Virgin of Canada, which is known to all of us today simply as the International Fatima Rosary Crusade or Fatima Crusader Magazine. And when he was seated on the board, he received a letter of congratulations from none other than Monsignor McGee, the personal secretary of Pope John Paul II. So it was clear that the Roman Pontiff had no problem with Father Gruner being elected to the board of directors of a lay apostolate. But the problem was that Father Gruner has this unfortunate tendency to speak the truth without compromise or fear of consequences to himself. And early in the 80s, he began to write about certain events in Canada, and in particular, the failure of one rather prominent prelate in this country to take a stand against the imminent liberalization or legalization of abortion in this country. I believe this prelate had taken the position that Catholics should not be involved in the legislative process on this. And Father Gruner wrote in his magazine that this was, of course, not a Catholic position. And by some strange coincidence, by about 1981, there were rumors afoot that someone was going to take some action against Father Gruner and the Vatican. So Father Gruner in 1981 wrote to the Pope. And as it turns out, the Pope's secretary, Monsignor McGee, read the letter from Father Gruner to the Pope, and things quieted down for a while. But then in 1989, the Bishop of Avellino contacted Father Gruner and said that he had received some worried signals from the Vatican Secretary of State. But no one ever specified what these worried signals were all about. Nevertheless, the signals were causing the Bishop of Avellino to tell Father Gruner that he should find another bishop as soon as possible. Well, Father Gruner had attempted to find a bishop, but he found that he was blocked on a couple of occasions by interventions of the apostolic nuncio. And when he went to Rome to inquire about the situation, he was told by a high-ranked official in the Congregation for the Clergy that it was the nuncio that was interfering in his incarnation, because by this point he was rather unpopular with certain prelates in Canada, and at this time he was beginning to promote the Fatima message rather aggressively, speaking the truth about Fatima and its relation to the crisis in the church and the crisis in the world. Around October of 1989, a letter was sent by Cardinal Agostoni, who was then involved with the Congregation for the Clergy, and the letter told the Bishop of Avellino that he should recall Father Gruner to the diocese and pretend that it was his idea. This letter would never have been uncovered, except that in the course of Canadian litigation a couple of years back, it turned up in the files of none other than the same prelate whom Father Gruner had criticized for his stand on abortion. And that letter came to light, and we knew that as early as 1989, the bishop was under pressure to recall Father Gruner to Avellino, where he had not been for some 11 or 12 years, and to pretend that it was the bishop's idea. The bishop himself had no desire to recall Father Gruner, because Father Gruner was living in Canada with his permission. Then, finally, in January of 1994, the successor Bishop of Avellino, under mounting pressure, issued a letter to Father Gruner dated January 31st, telling him to come back to Avellino because of scandals and outrages. But the letter did not specify the scandals or the outrages. There was absolutely no evidence in this letter, probably because there were no scandals and outrages, nor were there any factual bases for the worried signals from the Vatican Secretary of State. And then what happened was a strange process where Father Gruner was being told to find another bishop, but every time he found another bishop, some intervention from the congregation of the clergy would prevent that bishop from incarnating him. Between January 31st, 1994 and the acceleration of the case later on, there were 2 or 3 offers of incarnation that were made and blocked, thereby preventing Father Gruner from fulfilling the very order he was supposed to be fulfilling. Finally, in May of 1996, the Bishop of Avellino issued a second decree, which basically said to Father Gruner, since you haven't found another bishop, come back to Avellino. But by then he had found another bishop, the Archbishop of Hyderabad, who had given him a decree of incarnation to sponsor what the bishop himself called God's work in his archdiocese, and that work included the establishment of an orphanage, which to this day is supporting somewhere between 60 and 70 orphans, thanks to the resources of the apostolate. So, at that point, the people who wanted Father Gruner recalled pulled a little procedural maneuver. They told the Bishop of Avellino to tell Father Gruner that the incarnation in Hyderabad was non-existent. Didn't exist. So now Father Gruner was in the position of being called back to Avellino, and he was told that his incarnation was non-existent in the Archdiocese of Hyderabad. But why was it non-existent? Because he had been called back to Avellino. But why had he been called back to Avellino? Because he hadn't found a bishop. But wasn't the Archbishop of Hyderabad a bishop? Well, the incarnation in Hyderabad is non-existent. It's a classic circular argument. So he found himself trapped in this procedural gambit where he had tried to comply with the order to find a bishop, and people in the Congregation for the Clergy were preventing him from finding a bishop, and then he was accused of being disobedient for failing to find a bishop. So the canonical appeals went on and on and on, and here Father Gruner is under threat of being suspended if he did not return to Avellino for failing to find a bishop that they had prevented him from finding. Finally, to accelerate my description of the case, because I could go on for days talking about it, in July of 1999, only a couple of months ago, another decree came down, this time from the Apostolic Signatura, which is the highest court in the church. And this decree basically said that Father Gruner had to go back to Avellino after 22 years for one reason only. He had a conditio irregularis, which is a fancy Latin way of saying an irregular condition. Now, if you examine the document and ask yourself what is irregular about his condition, the document says 2 things. Number one, it was irregular because he was living in Canada. But the Code of Canon Law makes it clear, and I'm quoting Canon 283, that a priest can live outside the diocese of his incarnation, provided he has at least the presumed permission of his proper ordinary. And I'm sure there are a number of priests here today who are living outside the dioceses of their incarnation, either studying or working in some other diocese with permission of their ordinary. And Father Gruner had more than presumed permission. He had a written decree from 1978 stating that he could live in Canada or in any event outside the Diocese of Avellino, whose bishop really had no use for him. So there was nothing irregular about that. The other basis for this irregular condition was supposedly that Father Gruner was involved in the apostolate, which is sponsoring this conference. But Canon 299, as I explained to you yesterday, states that the faithful have a natural right to form and participate in private associations of the faithful. And Canon 278 specifically says, and I'm quoting, secular clerics have the right of association with others for the achievement of purposes befitting the clerical state. Secular cleric is a cleric who's not a member of a religious order. He's basically a diocesan priest who does not live in the world, who does not live inside of an order, but lives in the world at large. And so Father Gruner, as a secular cleric, had the natural right of association. And amazingly enough, this decree of the Signatura in July of 1999 openly admitted that there is absolutely nothing illegitimate about the apostolate itself. So that was the basis for his irregular condition, participating in an apostolate that is not illegitimate. And if you want to get an appreciation of how much freedom priests and nuns have to participate in apostolates, consider Mother Angelica's apostolate. She has a radio and TV network that goes all around the world. And even though Cardinal Mahoney is furious with her because of things she said about him and has called for an apology, no one has said that Mother Angelica cannot broadcast. No one has even dared to say that she must stop what she's doing, shut down her TV and radio network. Why? Because she has the right to participate in a private apostolate without any episcopal permission whatsoever. And so does Father Gruner. So his basic canonical situation is that he's being told he's got to go back to the Diocese of Avellino after 22 years because he has an irregular condition consisting of, number one, living in Canada with his bishop's permission, and number two, being involved in an apostolate he has the right to be involved in. That's the case against Father Nicholas Gruner. In other words, there's no case because his irregular condition is just not irregular. So at this stage, we have a priest who is told, like poor Costello, go ahead, order a sandwich, go ahead, live in Canada. In fact, as recently as January of 1994, just before the first order to come back, Father Gruner said to the Bishop of Avellino in a face-to-face meeting, well, what should I do now? And the bishop said, go back to Canada. And now, like Abbott, certain people in the Vatican congregation are smacking Father Gruner in the head. But it isn't just a joke, because here is a priest age 57 who has never been paid a farthing by the Diocese of Avellino. He has no pension, no provision for medical coverage. He's not even an Italian citizen. He can't go back to Italy. If he were to go there now, they would deport him upon arrival. Because although the bishop was pressured into ordering him back, the Bishop of Avellino never took any of the steps necessary to get Father Gruner the proper immigration status. And that would mean the bishop would have to guarantee in writing that Father Gruner would have medical coverage, that he would have salary for the rest of his life, and that there'd be provision for him so that he would not become a public charge in Italy. That hasn't even been done. So not only is there no irregular condition, he's been ordered to do something that is legally impossible under immigration law. And the Signatura in this latest decree had only this to say about that. Well, said the decree, lots of priests work in Italy. That was the sole extent of their consideration of that issue. Of course, those priests have the proper visas, and Father Gruner doesn't. And oddly enough, the same decree of the Signatura said that Father Gruner can't be incarnated in Hyderabad because he doesn't have the proper immigration status. So, I guess immigration is a problem if you're incarnated in Hyderabad, but not if you're incarnated in Avellino. You can be sent back there after 22 years as an illegal alien, and then I guess what would happen is he would hide in the Diocese of Avellino until the police discovered him, and then they would throw him out when he was, say, 65 or so, and he would come back here, and all of his personal affairs would be in ruins, the apostolate would be destroyed, but what would that matter? Because he has an irregular condition. Now, I told you I would draw a comparison, but let me first summarize the state of affairs in this case, which is still under appeal, by the way. According to the latest decree, even though the law of the church states that priests can live outside their dioceses with only the presumed permission of their bishop, in Father Gruner's case, he cannot live outside the diocese even though he has written permission. While the law of the church says that priests can engage in private apostolates without episcopal approval, and even like Mother Angelica had a worldwide television network that attacks Cardinal Mahoney, in Father Gruner's case, he can't have an apostolate even if the bishop does approve. This decree says even if 3 bishops have offered him incarnation in 3 different dioceses with approval to continue his apostolate in Canada, that's irregular. Not for anybody else in the church. Not for Mother Angelica, not for any of the priests here who are engaged in private apostolates, but only for Father Gruner. The decree goes on to say that although a priest cannot be denied excardination from his own diocese in favor of a benevolent bishop, unless there's a grave reason to prevent him from leaving, in Father Gruner's case, he can be denied excardination basically without any reason whatsoever, except an irregular condition. But the irregular condition consists of doing things that are legal. So in Father Gruner's case, he's denied excoordination for doing what is legal. And that's the essence of the grave reasons. And finally, while Italian immigration law says that Father Gruner cannot come back to Italy after 22 years and just walk in there with a visitor's visa, and that the bishop has to take certain steps, for Father Gruner, those steps are not necessary. He's just supposed to go back to Italy as an illegal alien and live there with no promise for his support in old age, no salary, nothing at all. And this is supposed to be a just result in Father Gruner's case, because as the decree states, the decree was rendered having only God before our eyes. So, now to the comparison. We're all familiar with cases of people who make a veritable career out of questioning church teaching, people who set up private apostolates like We Are Church, which, by the way, just presented a petition to the Pope at the Vatican calling upon him to change all kinds of Catholic dogma. We're familiar with these people and with these organizations conducting their affairs without being molested by anybody in the Vatican. We are familiar with the Karl Boffs, the Kungs, the Foxes, the Currans, who go on and on and on, questioning Catholic dogmas and doctrines. Even on television, nothing is done to them. About the best recent example I can think of is the case of Father Nugent and Sister Gramick, former heads of the New Ways ministry. Now, I want to discuss this case briefly, and I want you to keep in mind what happened to Father Gruner in the space of a few years, and what has not happened to Gramick and Nugent. In 1977, Gramick and Nugent began their New Ways ministry, which goes around the country and around the world, contradicting the Holy Father and the constant teaching of the Church that the homosexual condition is intrinsically disordered, that it's wrong in and of itself. The condition is intrinsically disordered. It's contrary to nature. They were going around saying, well, no, it's just an orientation which has to be accepted for what it is, and we should deal with this orientation, recognizing that it's part of nature, just like the heterosexual orientation. And they were doing this for year after year after year, and no action was taken against them. Finally, after 7 years of preaching this error and confusing the faithful, the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life told them to sever their ties with New Wave Ministries. So what they did was, they resigned as officers and went on with the ministry. And they went on and on and on and on with the ministry, doing nothing more than resigning as officers, basically openly defying the Vatican congregation. Now, with lightning rapidity, after only 11 more years of contradicting church teaching and disobeying their superiors, the Vatican established a commission to study the teaching of Nugent and Gramick. 18 years of promoting error and defying authority, and the Vatican sets up a commission to study the situation. Meanwhile, they're going all over the world, confusing people, spreading error throughout the church, and contradicting settled teaching. Now, after the commission was set up, you would think that, well, finally some action will be taken against Gramick and Nugent. Well, another 6 years went by before the commission issued its findings in 1994. And what were these findings? Well, the teaching of Gramick and Nugent had certain positive aspects, but there are serious deficiencies which were incompatible with the fullness of Christian morality. So, these people were preaching against Christian morality at this point for some 18 or 20 years, and the Vatican so far has issued some findings that their teaching is inconsistent with Christian morality. And at this point, they have been subject to no punishment whatsoever. Now, when the commission issued its findings, the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life took action. Did it discipline them? Did it say you're suspended? Did it say go back to the place where your order is and stay there? No, it recommended some form of notification about Gramick and Nugent. 17 years of disobedience, and the recommendation is some form of notification. And then the congregation said, well, you know, this really involves a doctrinal question because these people have been contradicting Catholic doctrine. So they turned it over to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Got rid of the whole case. Now they don't have to do anything at all, and it's in the hands of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Well, they were on the fast track. Only 2 more years went by. Now we're up to 20 years of open disobedience and teaching of error before the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith takes action. And what did the congregation do? The congregation doesn't suspend them. The congregation doesn't say they're teaching error. The congregation asks them to answer some questions and submit an affirmation that they believe in Catholic teaching. This is what they're doing after 20 years of this. And what happens? Well, Gramick and Nugent answer some questions and submit the affirmation, and then another year passes, and the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, says, you know, those answers just aren't satisfactory. They're going to have to proceed further. So what do? They don't discipline them. They don't suspend them. They write back to Nugent and Gramick, and they ask them to formulate a declaration. Now we're up to 21 years. And it's obvious that these people have no intention of obeying. It's obvious that they're running around the world contradicting Catholic teaching. And they're being asked after 21 years of doing this, 21 years, to formulate a declaration. Not a whiff of punishment, or even the threat of punishment at this point. Finally, another year goes by. We're up to July 14th, 1999. And the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith finally announces that their doctrine is dangerous and erroneous and has caused confusion among the Catholic people and harmed the community of the Church. No kidding. And here it is, 1999. This problem began in 1977. Where were you in 1977? An entire generation has passed. And these people are globe-trotting with impunity and contradicting church teaching. And no one has even threatened to suspend them. So what did the CDF do when it decided that these people had been causing confusion and harming the Catholic Church for 22 years? Did it suspend them? No. It said that they were to cease ministering to homosexuals, and they could not hold offices in their respective institutes. But the CDF did not say that they must be silent, and the CDF did not say that they must retract their errors, and the CDF did not say that they must repudiate their 2 books promoting these errors, which were erroneous and dangerous. All they had to do was stop ministering to homosexuals and not hold offices in their particular institutes. The priest remains a priest in good standing, and the nun has never been censured, and they can still express their opinions. I suppose sooner or later, if they keep expressing these opinions, the Vatican will finally do something. What it is, I don't know. But that is the double standard of justice we unfortunately see in the Church today. And it isn't just Father Gruner who's a victim of this double standard. I happen to be a very strong supporter of the priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. I believe that Catholics should, wherever possible, exercise their obligation to remain in communion with the local bishop, and the fraternity offers that opportunity to do so while retaining our liturgical traditions. I've always supported them, and I always will. They have become tremendously successful in this country because their witness is authentic. And they have done remarkably well in preserving the traditional liturgy and making it more and more available to people. And in fact, I think it was Time magazine recently speaking about a traditional chapel operated by the fraternity with the permission of the local bishop. It was Time magazine which spoke of Generation X discovering the traditional Mass and saying to itself, this is the real thing, this is what we want. And Time magazine was saying this is a young people's movement. So the fraternity, with full permission of bishops, in full accordance with the law of the Church, was making tremendous strides in bringing back the traditional liturgy. And I'm not here to take a position on the traditional liturgy as opposed to the new Mass, which I have always affirmed is valid, but the fraternity was being very successful in promoting tradition. But then something happened. A few priests in the fraternity in France wrote a letter to the Ecclesia Dei Commission in the Vatican. Just a letter, complaining about the fraternity. And these priests were being disobedient. They went behind their superior's back, Father Bizig, who was the head of the fraternity, and they fired off a letter to the Vatican complaining about their superior behind his back. And in their own letter they say, we recognize this is really not the way priests should normally behave, but this is a terrible emergency. And the letter went on to issue all kinds of vague complaints about the fraternity being rigorous and too rigid and not willing to adapt the 1962 Missal to current liturgical changes, even though the Holy Father himself said that they were chartered to promote and preserve that Missal. That was the very purpose of the motu proprio Ecclesia Dei. So these priests complained to about their superior behind his back. Now, in a typical case, for example, some priests complained about the Jesuit order. In a typical case, the letter of complaint is sent right back to the head of the order by the congregation, and the congregation says, deal with it. In this case, Father Bizig never knew about the letter until the Vatican lowered the boom. He gets a decree from the Congregation for the Clergy, which basically says, we got this letter, this is very serious. Your chapter meeting is suspended, and you are not to make any changes or take any significant actions in the fraternity until we have a special meeting. And we will send to you an apostolic representative, and he will tell you how you will be governed and what you will do with the fraternity in the future, including your liturgical practice. No due process, no hearing, no chance even to answer this letter, and Father Bizig finds himself de facto suspended, and the fraternity will now await instructions on how it will be, in all likelihood, dismantled or otherwise severely compromised. On the basis of what? A letter from a few priests. Meanwhile, Gramick and Nugent spend a quarter of a century harming the church and promoting error, and at the end of the process, they aren't even suspended. And this is the double standard that's at work in the church today. And I find it quite invidious, and I believe it's one of the more serious problems in the post-conciliar church. And it's always the same. The people who promote something that belongs to the traditional faith too successfully find themselves on the fast track. They get no justice. They're either threatened with suspension or otherwise harshly punished, whereas the heretics run around for decades. In fact, we all heard Cardinal Sodano last June publicly praise the heretic Hans Kung, who has said that our Pope is a despot. And he said that Hans Kung has written beautiful pages on the Christian mystery. And Kung was never suspended from the priesthood either. He's denied just about every dogma. And here is the Vatican Secretary of State, the same one who had worried signals about Father Gruner, publicly praising this heretic and this open enemy of the Pope. And this is what's going on in the post-conciliar church. So now, apparently those who would like to silence Father Gruner think the case is over. But it isn't. For one reason that I'll talk about now. I mentioned incarnation in the Archdiocese of Hyderabad and how it was declared non-existent. But the Archbishop does not agree. Earlier this year, he sent Father Gruner a subsequent decree. And he said, and I quote, "Having reviewed the documents of Father Nicholas Gruner, I am satisfied that my decree of November 4th, 1995, incarnating Father Gruner into the Archdiocese of Hyderabad is valid and effective. I am convinced that I acted correctly, though I was partly misled by influential people. I strongly feel the good work he is doing in spreading devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary should not be hampered for the present, especially through undue canonical or juridical pressures. May Jesus Christ be praised," end quote. Now, I would like to see what happens, because I don't see how an archbishop can have his jurisdiction trampled upon any longer by someone in a Vatican congregation who wishes to declare his incarnation non-existent without any canonical basis. All they can say about Father Gruner is that he was living in Canada with permission of his bishop, and that he was conducting an apostolate he had every right to conduct, which not even the Vatican says is illegitimate. So where do we go from here? This is what I'm waiting to see, and so the case of Father Gruner is not closed. There's more to this story, and Incidentally, Father Gruner has filed another document with the Vatican Tribunal called a Restitutio in Integrum. Because as I told you earlier in the talk, in 1994, Father Gruner was accused of scandals and outrages by the Bishop of Avellino. There were no scandals and outrages. And in the latest decree, there isn't a single reference to any scandal or any outrage. That's all been dropped. And the purpose of a restitutio integrum is to say, look, if you made an accusation against me, and now at the end of the process you admit there was never anything there to begin with, I am entitled to my good name. Restitutio. I want a restoration of my good name. And so we're seeking a declaration that the original complaint that there were scandals and outrages was a fraud. There's no evidence of it, and Father Gruner is entitled to a restitutio in integrum and a vacation of this entire sentence against him, so that he can do what everyone else in the church has been doing and has the right to do. Because for too long, Father Gruner has been the victim of a law for one man. And as I told you in my first talk, a law for one man is no law at all. This priest is entitled to the same procedural rights, the same right to due process as Gramick and Nugent. And we should all pray that he gets due process in this case. And so I'll conclude, because I know it's the dinner hour, by saying simply that we can be thankful to God that the case of Father Nicholas Gruner has not yet been closed. And neither has the cause of Our Lady of Fatima been ended, because heaven itself will not allow it to end until her cause has triumphed. Father Gruner will go on, he will struggle to do God's will, and sooner or later Father Gruner will pass away. But the words of Our Lady of Fatima will not pass away until every single word is fulfilled. Thank you, and God bless you.